Some of these photos were hidden for over 80 years. Taken by German soldiers in summer 1941, these photos show the war as it really was, raw and rarely seen. They moved fast. Nazi Germany had taken Poland, crushed France, and marched across Europe. Then, in June 1941, they turned east, toward the Soviet Union. At first, it looked like just another easy victory, but what came next turned that confidence into horror. These photos aren't from propaganda films, they're real moments captured by the men who fought there. Most people have never seen these images before. This isn't history from school books. This is how it really looked. The photographs were taken in Belarus during the summer of 1941, the very beginning of the war. German troops are advancing. Based on the emblems and insignia on the vehicles, we can tell that the photographer was from 7th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. This unit was formed from a light division after the Polish campaign in October 1939. In this shot you can see a column of flamethrower tanks, the Panzer II Flamingo. In this image we see a Wehrmacht soldier during the opening days of the attack on the USSR. From June 7, 1941, the 7th Panzer Division was actively engaged on the Eastern Front. At the start of the campaign, the division had around 400 officers and 14,000 enlisted men. Here, soldiers scanned the terrain through a stereo viewer nicknamed Rabbit Ears. Hitler envisioned a quick blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union, a rapid war that would bring Stalin's government crashing down. That was the only way to justify opening another front. And at first, it seemed like the plan might succeed. On July 3, 1941, Franz Holder, chief of the German Army General Staff, wrote in his diary, "The campaign is essentially won in 2 weeks." But while the Soviet army was retreating, it wasn't surrendering without a fight. German casualties mounted. In this image, soldiers mourn a fallen comrade. Here is a typical Wehrmacht grave, a birch cross with helmets. We can even make out the names written on the cross. This photo was likely taken in Belarus, near the town of Vitebsk, deep in the Soviet Union. We see more 7th Panzer troops at their positions. Here, a German tanker studies a map on the roadside. Sometimes the photographer captured his comrades while they were sleeping. Here, officers are planning their next move. An ordinary rest stop. Here we see a radio operator during a rare quiet moment. This is what Wehrmacht field tents look like. Here, soldiers stand at a destroyed bridge, likely blown up by retreating Soviet forces. And this is a Soviet train loaded with tanks that never made it to battle. Some of the Soviet tanks had been destroyed during the retreat. In this next photo, an SD KFZ-251 half-track rolls through an occupied Belarusian village. A Wehrmacht soldier walks through a scorched settlement. On some fronts, the Wehrmacht had advanced 500 to 600 kilometers. Their average pace was 15 to 30 kilometers per day. Here are villagers and Wehrmacht troops in occupied territory. The photographer captured women and children in the villages. Some older men had stayed behind. They weren't drafted in the early Soviet mobilization, which at first only took younger men. Initially, the USSR didn't mobilize men born before 1905. Those older than 36. Later they extended the draft up to age 46, then 51. This photo shows a kind of town meeting, with both Germans and Belarusians present. Daily life didn't stop, but now local villagers had to feed not only their families, but also the enemy soldiers occupying their homes. Here women are threshing wheat. German troops at rest. One is writing a letter or keeping a diary. Another, wearing only underwear, reads the Panzerfaust, a military propaganda paper. Sometimes a military orchestra performed for the troops. Here soldiers listen to a concert. One of them holds a film camera. Not every German soldier was a committed Nazi. Not every man in the Wehrmacht shared Hitler's genocidal ideology. Some joined simply out of duty or fear, but whatever their reasons, they became part of a brutal, criminal war. At the time these photos were taken, many of them may have truly believed they were heroes, loyal sons of the fatherland. But history has since put things in perspective, and it will continue to do so. If you've made it this far, it means you care about real history, not just headlines. So please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Here are burnt out houses in the town of Novorozev. Only stone stoves remain standing, a common image in Russian towns after the German invasion. In the photos you can see the soldiers inspecting what's left. They explore the ruins. On one of the stoves, a frying pan still hangs, a tiny piece of normal life destroyed by war. Novorzev was heavily damaged. A German column moves through the town, even on horseback. This is the town's main street, with the old church. Before the invasion, Soviet authorities had already closed this church, turning it into a garage, part of their campaign to erase religion. Some images capture the absurdity of war. Here we see a taxidermy bear tied to a lamppost, probably stolen from a local museum. At the front, there is a German road sign pointing to Opochka, another town in the region. Here is a column of German troops. One rides a bicycle, and as we'll see later, bicycles were widely used by the Wehrmacht. In this village, buildings appear untouched, but in the background, smoke rises, likely from burning houses nearby. Here, the Wehrmacht crosses a river using a pontoon bridge. Once again, we see German graves, this time somewhere deep in the Soviet territory. It's likely that the Germans hoped that after victory and full occupation, they would come back to care for their fallen. As we know, that hope never came true. The Nazi forces would soon have to abandon these places. Eventually, the tide would turn, but in the summer of 1941, it still looked like Nazi Germany might win. The US hadn't entered the war, and the Soviets were barely holding on. In another image, German soldiers are peeling potatoes during a break. Take a note of how many bicycles are present. The 219th Division had its own bicycle infantry unit, as did the Red Army. These units were typically used as couriers. This is an infantry division, not motorized. The soldiers moved on foot or by horse, just like in World War I. In fact, these images challenge the idea that the Wehrmacht was this terrifying, modern armored force. As German historian Thomas Vogel writes, the army was far from modern, especially in the early days of the war. Motorization levels were low. In fact, 90% of the initial force consisted of standard infantry divisions, whose troops marched on foot, just like in World War I. Horses were still the main way to move supplies and artillery. Here we see destroyed Soviet T-26 tanks. At the time, the most widely used tank in the Red Army. They were based on a British design purchased in 1930. Another image shows a grave of 4 German soldiers. And here's an entire German cemetery in an occupied Soviet village. Here is a photo of a Junkers Ju-88, a versatile and widely used Luftwaffe combat aircraft. A German unit is resting in an occupied town. On the right side of the photo, you can see a white statue of Vladimir Lenin. Another photo shows a group of Soviet soldiers being taken prisoner. The Germans are giving them water and medical attention. On the right, a seriously wounded Red Army soldier lies on a stretcher. This image disrupts our usual assumptions, but in fact, German treatment of Soviet POWs was relatively humane, especially for small groups of soldiers who surrendered. Here's another destroyed T-26 tank. Most bridges had been blown up, so Germans used pontoon bridges to cross rivers. In this photo, you can see the remains of the old bridge on the left and the new pontoon bridge on the right. Across the water, more wrecked Soviet equipment can be seen. Here are abandoned Soviet howitzers from 1937. German soldiers posed near them. But soon, the easy victories faded, and the war began to feel like a death march. From August 1941 to January 1942, the 219th Infantry Division lost 10,000 men in combat. In 1942, the division was encircled in the Demyansk pocket and suffered catastrophic losses. By March 1943, it had only 1,200 soldiers left, less than 10% of its original strength. It was later reorganized and continued retreating with the rest of the German army until spring 1945, when it finally surrendered to the Red Army in Courland, modern-day Latvia. Watch my next video, where I show what Berlin really looked like in May 1945 through rare photos most people have never seen. Click to see what Berlin looked like when the war came home to Germany. If you found this work interesting and important, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Links are in the description. That's all for now. See you next time.